Well, we're halfway through Literature Month, so it's as good a time of any to talk about genre. I'm One Ring, and welcome to my channel. But, anyways, most people see genre as a strict delineation from fiction to nonfiction. In reality, it's more of a big ball of wibbly wobbly, tropey wopey stuff. And yes, that is a paraphrase of a Doctor Who quote. You're welcome. But in and that's one of the difficult things about talking about art and literature and stuff is because there are so many ways to interpret it, because art and literature and any media of expression is ultimately objective, or not objective, subjective. Sorry. I mean, in one way, yeah, it is objective, because you can say that is objectively a thing a person has made, so therefore it is art. Or you can objectively say, okay, it was written in this format, so it's a haiku. But when you start getting down into the nitty gritty of this is what, this fits an X genre, or this is about Y, then it becomes more subjective, because do you take authorial intent into mind, or do you take or do you go with death of the, or do you more strictly follow the death of the author mode of thought, where the only thing that matters is in the text? And what exactly is genre? And I will post a colloquial dictionary definition in the description. But the way we're going to be exploring it today, and mostly the way I kind of see it, is genre is more of a phylogeny or taxonomy of literature and similar forms of art. And I'm using taxonomy and phylogeny as very much as a metaphor or an allegory. Very much nearly the same thing. But because there are parts where that analogy falls apart. Because, for instance, in a biological, in actual phylogeny, you'll get a case where there's enough genetic drift to where one animal can't interbreed with another animal, and there's a strict delineation of species by our definition. But when it comes to things like art and literature and culture, there isn't really that kind of breaking point. Because one author is always influenced by others. You could write a space opera and still be, influenced by Tolkien. Or, you could write high fantasy and still pull influences from, settings like Frank Herbert's Dune, or perhaps Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End. Objectively one of the greatest sci-fi novels of all time. You can fight me on this. No, seriously, if you're a sci-fi buff and you haven't read Childhood's End, go read Childhood's End. It not only is it one of the greatest sci-fi novels of all time, but it is the greatest sci-fi novel that kind of looks into what exactly does it mean to be human, and what happens when, and where does humanity begin and where does humanity end, and what if humanity is meant to evolve into something greater. And I'm gonna leave it at that, because I'm not gonna spoil Childhood's End for anyone if they're gonna go read it. But back onto the railroad. Took enough of a detour around there. So, you have the, what's recognized as a genre. Well, comedy is a genre. Drama is a genre. You've got historical, you've got classic literature, you've got mythology, you've got science fiction, and you've got fantasy, and you've got, and like under these, categories, there are like thousands of thousands or hundreds and, of like mini genres. Like you have your steampunk, and you have your diesel punk, and you have your, alternate histories. You have your high fantasy, your urban fantasy, and, it goes on and on. And you'll have instances where, there's cross-pollination. Well, like Hitchhiker's Guide, it's comedic sci-fi. Pretty much anything written by Terry Pratchett, comedic sci-fi. Or, and there's this massive, especially in the modern day, where you can get so many cultural influences because of just the ease of communication. You can, so we'll, go back to what is genre. Now, in this video, I'm going to go under the definition of genre as a collection of tropes and themes. So, we'll kind of see the branches where they go. Like, for instance, Mary Shelley, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has a lot of the dark aesthetic, a lot of the aesthetic tropes of Gothic horror. And especially when it comes to, movies, the 1930s, Frankenstein is lumped in with that era's, Gothic horror kick, with, you got your Boris Karloff, you got your Vincent Price as Dracula, you've got The Mummy. But the thing is, it's also generally regarded as the first science fiction novel, because it introduces a lot of themes that science fiction, that the genre that will grow into being science fiction sets out to explore. You have man versus nature, or man versus God. You have the trope of the mad scientist. You have all these all these aesthetic tropes coming from Gothic horror, which was kind of the thing to write if you weren't writing social dramas and social comedies. And you have the burgeoning tropes that will become, that will grow into what is known as sci-fi. Where you're... And later on, like about 100 years later, you start getting your H.G. Wells and Jules Verne that really takes the "what hath man wrought" side of science fiction and turns it on its head. Where 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, we have the mad Captain Nemo waging his war against the rest of humanity from his fantastical submarine. And H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau, where you have a mad scientist taking animals and using vivisection and creating mimicries of man out of them. And it doesn't go well for him, because that's another trope of that brand of science fiction, where you have the man who would be God, and you have the hubris, look at what we can do, and then they are torn down by their own creations, which you could argue goes back to classical. By classical, I mean Greek and Roman mythology, where that's a big running theme in a lot of Greek myths, is the hubris of man is man's own downfall. And so as you go on, you get new tropes picked up, you get new tropes played with, and you get themes that keep developing and revolving, and you get little branches on this great tree of literature. Once again, going back to the phylogeny analogy. But the thing is, not only do you get a lot of cross-pollination, because there is no gene barrier, there is no, species don't make, two different species don't make viable, fertile offspring. An author or an artist can get inspiration from anything, and they can take influences from any other little pieces of work. And so not only do you have this cross-pollination, and you have these developing themes and tropes that are being explored and used, you also have people who will go and who will subvert those tropes. And that is what really breaks down this delineation. Is, like, for instance, there's this novel or this series of novels about rediscovering about dragon riders who rediscover the old ways to battle and, you know, a reappearing threat that descends from the skies. And it takes place on an alien planet named Pern. You know, Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern. If you read the book, it looks very much like like some kind of high fantasy novel. Very medieval setting. You know, riding around on fire-breathing dragons, burning, you know, burning silvery parasitic threads that come from the sky. But when you get down into the nitty-gritty of the lore, it's science fiction. Because what had happened was, it's the remnants of a space colony that had been set up, and there are these alien life forms that happen to look, you know, like our mists of dragons. And there are these, you know, alien parasitic threads that occasionally, you know, fall from, you know, get drawn into the gravitational pull of the planet. And if they land, then, you know, if they touch the ground, they start devouring all the organic life on the planet. So they've got to get burned. Or like, you know, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. And if you want to read the Wheel of Time, good on you. Highly recommend it. I understand if you quit kind of through the middle because it kind of gets bogged down. But you can't really skip any of it because everything kind of becomes important. Because that's just kind of the theme, is how different threads of people's lives kind of come together to make this grand epic. But it, you know, it's very much high fantasy. And you get, and this theme of how the legends, you know, the history of today become the legends of tomorrow, and then eventually become forgotten. And there are a couple little seeds, you know, dropped in where it's a post-apocalypse. In fact, one of the there's like a little paragraph in one of the books in the middle where, you know, they're kind of telling old stories, and someone mentions like the story of Mosk and Merc, two giants who fought with spears of fire. And you could easily take that to mean the Cold War went hot thousands and thousands of years before this, you know, before this setting. And, you know, gave rise to one of the previous ages. Or how, you know, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which basically set out what high fantasy is, you know, was meant to give Britain a mythic tradition which had been stolen, you know, from them by Christianization, and two, ends in very much a way that this, you know, this is the world before. This is our, you know, this is Britain's age of heroes, where, you know, a mythic history. And I guess what you can say is largely genre isn't cut and dry. Now, as always, there are exceptions. Because most genres are, you know, defined by the themes and tropes that they explore. However, there are a couple of outlying genres that are defined by the themes and tropes that they avoid or that are banned from being considered. And one of which is obviously Christian literature, because as mentioned earlier in Lit Month, you can't really talk about the supernatural unless it's from a strictly Judeo-Christian point of view. And the more fantastic elements that you're putting into your story, the more allegorical it has to be. The more it has to point towards the light of Jesus. And then you have the quote-unquote comic book genre. The superhero genre. Which is not so much defined by tropes that they're not allowed to, tropes and themes that they're not allowed to explore anymore, because the era of the Comics Code Authority had ended, is ended. But having a span of time, like 2+ decades, to where you were heavily restricted on what exactly you could say and what themes you could explore with in the genre, left its mark and made what comic books are today what they are today. And it's what I like to call the Silver Age effect. When you restrict a genre, it gets either bland and kind of boring, bland and samey, or it goes absolutely bonkers. And last week you saw kind of an example of that. But it's time for me to sign up for this week at least. So, like, comment, subscribe, do all the YouTube things, check out my Twitter, and remember, indoctrination is a hell of a drug.